abortion, suicide, Vladimir Putin. What do these three topics have in common other than to instantly get this demonetized from YouTube? Because these are three extremely controversial stories. So this is going to be Jason Carpenter's Controversial Cavalcade. I mean, it's kind of hard, right? With suicide and abortion, it's kind of hard to make jokes, but crazy, paranormal, and world-changing events today on Dead Rabbit Radio. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Dead Rabbit Radio. I'm your host, Jason Carpenter. I'm having a great day. Depressed. Oh man, I don't want to listen to this episode. I'm having a great day. I hope you guys are having a great day too. I hope you guys are having tons of fun doing whatever you're doing. You're like, I don't know. Might want to change the intro up for this episode. We got a ton of stuff to cover, so first off, walking into Dead Rabbit Radio Command, everyone get on your feet and give it up for Ian. Woohoo, yeah, haha, yeah. Ian's walking on into Dead Rabbit Radio Command. Ian, aka Some Guy 225, shared their Spotify Wrapped on their social media, letting the world know how much they love Dead Rabbit Radio. That's another way you can help the show grow, is by spreading the word. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell everyone you know Dead Rabbit Radio is your favorite paranormal show. And because Ian did that, Ian, you're going to be the captain, the pilot this episode. Ian, let's go ahead and get this episode started. I'm going to toss you the keys to the Jason Jalopy we're going to leave behind Dead Rabbit Radio Command. Why don't you drive us all the way out to Russia? Nice leisurely drive over to Russia. We're going to take the long way though. Make sure that we don't get taken out by a grenade-carrying drone. We show up in Moscow. All of these segments are fairly short, honestly. But they're all pretty intriguing. The reason why we're in Moscow is we're sitting there and President Vladimir Putin is giving a speech, and he goes, "You need to understand, people of Russia. This is not a fight between us and NATO." It kind of is at this point. This is not a fight. This is not just a fight, he meant to say. This is not just a fight between Russia and NATO. This is not just a fight between Russia and Ukraine. This is not just a fight between Russia and the US. No, this is a fight between Russia and the Golden Billion. And everyone rises to their feet and they're clapping, yeah, woo, yeah. And we're like, what? What's the Golden Billion? The Golden Billion, Putin continues, wants to take everything from us. Everything we have worked so hard for. They will take it. They will reap the rewards. Our country will be a cemetery. They're all cheering. They're all not to the last part. It's that you're taking on the Golden Billion. Putin's like, yeah. That's what you should be cheering about. The Golden Billion is the ultimate enemy of Russia. The Golden Billion is the ultimate enemy of civilization itself. That is what this war is against, ladies and gentlemen. That is what we are fighting for. As we're walking out of his speech, everyone's like still clapping, a little bit of residual clapping. They're like, man, it sure was really good. We're like, what in the world's the Golden Billion? And they go, sit down, babushkas, or whatever kid is in Russia. Sit down, little dasvidanyas. Take a seat. I'm going to tell you about the Golden Billion. And the guy makes us sit down. It's a soldier. He's all poking us with a bayonet. He's all, sit. We're all like, ah. The Golden Billion is super interesting. I found out about it because I read an article in the Washington Post. And it was super interesting because they're trying to tell me a conspiracy theory that is very popular in Russia. Vladimir Putin personally believes in the Golden Billion conspiracy theory. And while the article is telling me about this crazy conspiracy theory, they're also trying to tell me it's not real. And you're reading the article and you're like, listen, I don't agree with Putin on a lot of stuff. But there might be something behind this Golden Billion thing. It's something. Let me explain it to you, because you'll be like nodding your head. You're like, okay, when does the conspiracy theory part start? When's the crazy stuff start? Back in 1990, there was a book published in Russia by an author named Anatoly Sukhanov. It was called The Plot of World Government, Russia and the Golden Billion. Anatoly coined this term. He said that there is a global elite of 1 billion people. And these are Western countries who will do anything to subjugate the rest of the world, basically turn them into factories and sweatshops for cheap goods to be shipped to the West. They want to take over our farmland so they can have cheap food. They want to destroy our economies. They want to destroy our environment. They want to enslave everybody else. The Western countries want to take over the planet. And it doesn't matter what happens to anyone else. Any other culture, any other people, any other place will be enthralled to the golden billion. A population of 1 billion people in the West. The West wants to take over the planet. And you're like, okay, when does the conspiracy theory part start? It's super interesting to have a conspiracy theory where the enemy is 1 billion people. Normally in the West, our conspiracy theories are small. 13 families. Right? A small group. The Illuminati. Even when you look at stuff like the Bilderberg Group or the Trilateral Commission. Very, very small elite groups. The Golden Billion says, no, there's actually 1 billion people. It's a civilization that's trying to subjugate the rest of the planet. And the Washington Post is like, isn't that crazy? Vladimir Putin believes that there's a clash of civilizations going on right now. And I'm like, that's true, right? Reading the article, I'm like, I don't disagree with that. Yeah, that's basically it. Vladimir Putin believes that this is a battle not just between Russia and Ukraine or Russia and NATO. This is the final fight. This is what they've been gearing up for. This is the fight of the rest of the world versus the Golden Billion. And when you look at this conspiracy theory, or when you look at this geopolitical reality, the counter-elite, as they're termed in the Golden Billion theory, the counter-elite is Russia, Asia, and pretty much any nation south of the equator. Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, all of that. They have to fight against Europe and the United States. Because if they don't, well, this is where I get kind of off track, right? Because I don't want global war. I don't want global war, but I think any student of history can go, yeah, I mean, like, there's been an ascendancy of the West post-World War I. When we include the United States in it. Even before that, we had Britain, France, Germany running around, taking over the globe. Portugal, Spain, a part of it as well. It's that argument. It's an argument I always hear all the time when I'm reading the newspaper and they're talking about colonialism, or they're talking about, like, sweatshops exploiting third world workers. But it's so fascinating to read an article in the Washington Post and they're giving him no ground. They could say, oh no, there actually is an effort for Western countries to subjugate the rest of the planet because that is what countries and cultures do. That's what we've seen through all that history. No, the article keeps saying, isn't that crazy that he believes this? That's wacky. But in a sense, and this is why this is in the controversial episode, in a sense, in this situation, Vladimir Putin is right. It is a clash of civilizations. We do open sweatshops, and we do have all this stuff. We do exploit third world workers, to the point where now when you go to a coffee shop, they have to print on the cup, this cup of coffee was not made by exploited hands. An exploited farm worker did not make this cup of coffee, because it happens for basically any cup of coffee that doesn't have that warning label on it. Fascinating. The Washington Post is running counter propaganda against Putin's propaganda. And in doing so, they have to say, none of this is happening. This is all made up. This is all happening in just Putin's head. What a wacky guy. What a dangerous guy. Sometimes you do have to give the conspiracy theory a little bit of credit. I think you can say, yeah, the West is trying to do that, just like the Soviet Union was trying to do that at a point in time when they existed. Every country wants to export their values and take over. They could easily say, yeah, there is some truth to this, but sometimes you get so hard against the fight against the conspiracy theories in general, that when one pops up that's reasonable, you have to go, well, yeah, that part's true. Fascinating stuff. The Golden Billion, it's quite a big group. It's not just, 200 members or 10,000 family relatives that all can find their lineage in this original 13 family group. It's not like a bloodline. It's just a dude walking around his home. This is where it gets dangerous, right? It's just some dude living in Ohio going to the coffee shop, and he gets his coffee and it says, no one bled when they were picking the beans for this guy. You're like, oh, that makes me feel good. That guy in Idaho is a part of the Golden Billion. That dude who's just like driving his pickup truck, drinking his coffee, going to work as an accountant. He's the enemy. It's interesting because in the West we go, no, it's these families, it's these people, it's these celebrities, it's these politicians, what have you. But the majority of the world is totally fine. In this view, the Golden Billion, you pretty much have to wipe out a billion. You pretty much have to wipe out a billion people to take this theory off the table. So a lot of us would be a part of that conspiracy theory. A lot of us would be considered part of the Golden Billion. A lot of us would be enemies in this conflict. Which you don't find with most conspiracy theories. Which you don't really find in a lot of those. Ian, I'm going to go ahead and toss you the oars for the Dead Rabbit rowboat. We're leaving behind Russia. Why don't you row us all the way out to a motel? Ooh, splash. Ooh, splash. Rowing away from Russia. All the way out to this motel room. We don't have an exact location for this story, but back in the mid-2000s, that's kind of the date that I figured out by looking at the story. Back in the mid-2000s, we're going to meet a young woman. Her name's Molly. We'll call her Molly. We don't have a real name. Molly is going through some struggles in life directly connected to her parents, specifically her father, who we will call Ben. And Molly says, growing up, my parents would have issues. They'd argue a lot. There was a lot of drama going on. They really couldn't stand each other. Like, I started to realize that more and more as I got older, the chaos that was in that household. They couldn't stand each other. And Molly said she would always be there for her father. She was a daddy's girl through and through. She always found herself being there to just comfort him. And he would be there for her too. He'd be there for her too. Obviously, whenever she had a problem, as much as he could. We're going to meet a man who's dealing with some serious issues, but as much as he could, he would sit there next to Molly and he would try to comfort her like any father would, or should at least. But Ben ends up getting really, really sick. He has, is there advanced diabetes? Because if there is, he has it. He has really, really bad diabetes. I don't know if it's a sliding scale, but because of that, he becomes unhealthily skinny. He just is vanishing before Molly's eyes, becoming so frail. He's sick. It's sad watching a loved one waste away like that. She says, eventually my parents, they stopped living together, and my dad ended up living in a motel, and that's where we're at right now. We're looking through the window, and we see Molly visiting her father in the motel. She'd stopped by there. Molly, a young woman, she's going to the motel to visit her father and just hang out with him. And she said, one time I got there, and he was sobbing. He was just sobbing. Ben was never one to cry in front of people, but things were just getting too difficult. And all of those barriers that we put up to kind of control our emotions around eventually they just get whittled down. And Molly just goes in and sits next to him. And she knows just being there, present with him, is helping him. But life is hard scheduling-wise, not just like health-wise or mental health-wise. We are constantly being pulled this way or that way, whether it's jobs or school or personal obligations. So even though Molly couldn't always physically be there, she would text with him all the time. They would text back and forth, sharing, how was your day, things like that. Again, just a reminder that, Dad, there's someone here who loves you. There's someone here who needs you. Molly's known for a long time that it's not just a physical health thing, that's not just the struggles with her parents staying together. There's another more serious issue, and that's that her father is suicidal. Well, on May 6th, 2023, Molly gets the news. Her father was found dead in his car. And he had been dead for 4 days in the car before his body was found. Cause of death was ruled as suicide. The family is sad. Molly is devastated by this news. Absolutely just devastated. 3 days later, Molly said, I went to bed that night and I was dreaming. Just a normal dream. And then everything went white. There was a quietness to the white light. There was a calming nature to this void she was in. And then she was sitting on Grandma's back porch. It was summertime. And she was sitting on the porch like she had so many times in her childhood, so many times growing up. She's sitting on the back porch. She's looking out at Grandma's pool. Crystal blue water shining underneath the sunlight. Perfect green trees with their leaves blowing in the breeze. And that's when she hears a can open. Psst. She looks over, and sitting next to her is her dad. Her father sitting there in a chair, ice cold Bud Light in his hands. And he looked happy. He looked healthy. He looked like the man that he had not been for many years previous. He pulled the chair next to him. Molly, come take a seat. Molly walks over to the chair with just tears streaming down her face. And she sits next to her father. And they both just sit there. She hears the sounds of birds flying somewhere nearby. She hears the sound of her father breathing. It's so quiet in this space, she can hear her father breathe. She hears him take a sip of his ice-cold Bud Light. He turns to her and he smiles and he says, this is a quote, I'm all right. I'm all right. It's peaceful here. And that's when Dad reached over and put his hand on Molly's back and started rubbing her back. Like he used to do whenever she was upset. He would just sit there and rub her back. Tears are pouring out of Molly's eyes. It feels so real. She knows that he's dead. She knows this is a dream, but it feels so real. She can't say a word. She's just in the moment. And her dad reaches over, gives her a big hug, still rubbing her back, and he says to her, I love you. Molly, I love you. Molly wakes up crying. She wakes up and she's wiping the tears away from her eyes, and she's just besides herself. She believes that her father visited her in her dreams, that he came here to deliver that message. I'm okay. I'm happy. It's peaceful here. This happened in May 2023. She hasn't dreamt of her father since. We've done other episodes like this. We've done a couple. I've talked about personal experiences like this as well. Dreaming after somebody passes away, shortly after that, having the dream and they come to kind of say goodbye. It doesn't happen all the time, but when we look in the paranormal pantheon, it's quite common. It's not common across general experiences, but as far as like ghost stories, very, very common. You'll hear this type of story from people who don't even believe in ghosts. The reason why I included it in this episode, the controversial episode, is, obviously, listen, I want the story to be true. I'd rather not the first part be true, the advanced diabetes and the suicide part. But if that stuff has to be true, I want the second part of the story to be true. And also, let me say, this is posted online by someone going by the name Mars Bars XXX. But I understand how this can be controversial because, looking at just Catholicism, and I don't know what other mainstream religions take is on suicide. I'm Protestant. We're against it. Like, we don't advocate for it. But if you kill yourself, that does not mean that, in my personal religion, right? I know Catholicism is different. If you kill yourself, you don't go to purgatory, you don't go to hell. There's no torture in the afterlife. It's just a tragic event. It's something that happened, and everyone is totally blown away by it. It's not in a good way, not like you just went and saw Dune 2, blown away in a bad way. The reason why I included it in this controversial cavalcade is because two Catholics, right? There are more than 1 billion of them, super controversial. And I'd even argue to people who, you could say the story in a way is encouraging suicide, because the guy was like, everything's better now, look at me. He's all dancing, he's like, no diabetes for me. He's doing the gritty. It's not pro-suicide, just so we're clear. That's not where I'm coming from or why I'm telling the story. That's why it's on this episode. Because it could be considered super controversial. Because the idea is that if you commit suicide, you'll get the same paradise as everybody else. There's a lot of people who don't believe it, who actually believe the opposite. I generally don't go around criticizing religions. Unless it's like some super crazy cult where they cover everyone in paint thinner and set them on fire. I'll put that episode in the show notes. That was an old one. Generally, though, even the ones that people like to criticize, like Scientology or Jehovah's Witness or stuff like that, I don't go out of my way to really poke fun at other religions, because I know mine is pretty goofy as well. It has a checkered past, to say the least. It's a controversial story. A man who committed suicide, being like, unlimited Bud Light. I'm at my mom's house all day long. There's a pool. I get to hang out with my daughter. Like, what a life. Like, this is amazing. And that's generally the message we want to give when we talk about suicide. I found it a very beautiful ghost story, though. It is a father reaching out to his daughter one last time. But a beautiful story. I'm not advocating suicide at all. I just thought it was beautiful, but whether or not I say that, controversial to say the least. Ian, let's go ahead and toss you the keys to the world-famous Carpenter Copter. We are leaving behind this motel. Fly us all the way out to a church. You may be saying, Jason, those first two stories, kind of controversial, I guess. He said Vladimir Putin was right. That's the only thing that I remember from that part. And then he said, if you kill yourself, you'll go to grandma's house for the rest of eternity. I didn't say either of those things, to be clear. You're like, I don't know, with selective editing, Jason, and a little bit of AI magic, you did say those things. If those stories weren't controversial, this is I found the two best examples, but I run across these stories all the time. And I always read them and I go, And then I bookmark them because at some point I might cover that someday, and then I move on. Because this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where you're going to be like, wow. Or not. That's what makes it controversial, right? Some people go, oh no, I agree with that. Other people are like, typing out the email. Typing out, what's his email again? deadrapradio@gmail.com. It's the 1970s. We're sitting outside this church. It's weird, too, because it's not a Sunday. Why are we at church? It's not even a Sunday. It's not like a Saturday worship service. We're not Seventh-day Adventists. We're just sitting outside of this church. We look in the window. Nobody in the church, and we're sitting there. You're like, well, what are we doing at church? And I go, well, let me tell you a little story. We're in the 1970s. We're about to meet a young couple. We have, these don't have the real names. We're going to call him Phil and his girlfriend Monica. And they are truly, deeply in love. They love each other. And Phil and Monica both know that this is the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. Like, this is my soulmate. We were put on this earth to find each other. We did. And we're going to make this work. But they're not married yet. They're still dating, and they're having sex. They're having premarital sex, which we all know is a sin. They immediately send you to hell for that one. They're having premarital sex. And while Phil knows in his heart they are meant to be together, one day he gets some very troubling news. Monica comes to Phil and says, honey, I'm pregnant. And this totally takes Phil by surprise. He doesn't know that sex often leads to pregnancy, but Monica, you're on birth control. Like, how did you get pregnant if you're on birth control? And that's when Monica tells Phil, I was on birth control, honey. I wanted to have your child. I wanted to get pregnant, so without telling you, I stopped taking the birth control. And Phil is a taxi cab driver. And he says, Phil goes, I have a lot of time to think. Because I'm driving around, whether or not I have a fare in the back or not, I'm just driving around and I'm constantly thinking about everything. And this is boiling his blood. Not because he hates Monica, he wants to marry her. Not because he doesn't want to have kids with Monica, he does. But he says, he goes, I wanted us to get married because we wanted to get married. I did not want us to get married because we had to get married. I did not want that to be part of our story. And if she is pregnant, I have to marry her. People in the community, family members, all that stuff will think I married her because I had to, but I don't want people to think that. I don't want to think that. I want to marry her because I love her. So he eventually tells Monica, you have to have an abortion. And she does. Phil said he's driving his taxi cab and he can't stop thinking about any of this. The initial deception, he goes, I'm very, very upset that she deceived me in the first place. That hurt my heart. That hurt my heart. But he was also upset that he had her get an abortion. And he's trying to figure out all this stuff. He's thinking, what a mess. What a mess I have made of my life. Like, what happened here? And he's trying to go back and forth. Now, the easy answer, there's no easy answers. He's thinking, I should have just let her have the child. We're going to have kids eventually. I want to spend the rest of my life with this woman. I should have just let her have the child. But I love this quote when he was writing this out. He said, the deception is what just got at him. And he said, quote, sadly, my heart was too hard. Which is such a good way to put that, right? We find ourselves in that position. We will harden our hearts. Even in situations where we need to be open and empathetic. Because we're so wounded, we're just like, nope. But it's an abortion. There's no going back from that. The process has been done. This is eating. All of this stuff is eating at Phil. Well, one day, as a taxi cab driver, he's told to go pick up a fare at a church. And he thought that was weird because it's not Sunday. It's not a service day. But, you're a cabbie. Drive on out there. He drives on out there in the cab, and he gets to the church, and there's nobody outside. He waits a little bit, and then he gets out of the cab, and he walks up and tries to open the church door. It's locked. I have no idea what's going on. Okay, maybe it was a prank or a mistake or something like that. I'll have to get back to the cabbie headquarters to figure it out. He walks back to his cab, and he gets in, and that's when he hears something behind him. And he looks over, and he sees a boy getting into the back of the cab. And he asks the boy, "Where do you want to go?" And the kid says nothing. He goes, "This kid, he looked very unfriendly. He looked like he didn't want to be there. He looked like he didn't want to engage with me. He didn't like anything about me. There was just this unfriendly, very distant aura about him. And this kid's holding an envelope. And he kind of is holding it out, and Phil reaches back and he grabs the envelope. He realizes there's money in it, and on the front of the envelope is an address. So, okay, maybe this kid's some mute. Maybe this kid can't talk. Maybe he was born with resting bitch face. I don't know. But Phil hits the little cling, the little flag button on his fare counter and starts driving to this destination. And he goes, as I'm driving, I would look up in the rearview mirror and I would try to make eye contact with the boy, and he would never look at me. And Phil goes, I tried making conversation with the kid. Hey, did you see that game the other day? The Oakland A's were hitting balls all over the place. And the kid would never respond to anything that he said. And Phil tried this a couple times and then eventually gave up because the kid, it just doesn't want to interact with him. So Phil's driving the taxi cab, and like it has so many times recently, his mind starts to wander, and he starts thinking about the situation with Monica. He starts thinking about the situation with the birth control, the pregnancy, and he starts thinking about the abortion. And then at that moment, he realized something. Something weird was going on. Like, he realized the event that he is in right now, he put it as, quote, somehow I knew that something strange and marvelous was happening at that very moment. He gets to the driveway of the destination, shuts off the meter, sits there for a moment. He sees how much the ride cost. He opens up the envelope to take the money out, make change, give it back to the kid. He opens up the envelope. It's the exact amount of money, the exact amount that would pay the fare from the church to the house. And Phil's like, what? Like, how would he know? How would this kid or whoever gave him the envelope know exactly how much this ride was going to cost? And he goes, I was amazed, but in a way I expected it. I knew before I opened the envelope it would exactly cover the amount. The boy gets out of the car, starts walking towards the house, and that is when Phil realizes that the boy walking towards the house is his own aborted son. It pops in his head and he realizes that's the kid that me and my wife were going to have. And right when that comes in his head, right when that thought pops in his head, the boy turns and makes direct eye contact with Phil, who's still sitting in the taxi cab. And Phil hears the boy in his mind. It's a telepathic connection between him and this child, who we don't know how old, all right? I imagine probably 6 or 7. Definitely not fetus age, right? That's one of the weird things about it. Well, you're like, that's the weird thing? We'll get into it in a second. It's a normal-aged boy. It wasn't just like the zygote in the backseat. He turns and he looks at the boy and receives a telepathic message, and he hears this phrase, quote, "You're forgiven," which is not to say you have approval. The boy turns and walks up to the house. And Phil drives away. Phil said he couldn't get this out of his head, which to be fair, right? You wouldn't be able to think about anything else. He goes, later, I turned my cab around and went back there, and the house was gone. There was no house there. And he said to this day, he posted this within the past couple months, he said to this very day, I remember the address of that house. I remember the address that I dropped that boy off to this day. That was posted online by someone going by the name Not Illogical. And again, like I often do, I feel like I gotta repeat myself every so often. I go through other things that these people have posted to see if it's a bunch of craziness. These once-in-a-lifetime ghost stories, I like to see, have they gone through 10 of these? Have they gone through 0? When I'm covering it on the show, it's everything else they post about is completely normal stuff, and then you get one once-in-a-lifetime paranormal story. That's a great way to kind of vet this stuff. Because if he said, oh yeah, 3 weeks later the boy came to my house and said, want to play catch, Dad? Then I know that he's just making stuff up. And I come across a lot of that. Because this story's absolutely bizarre, and controversial doesn't even cut it. There are a ton. I come across these quite often. We're going to cover another one. It's quite short, but it's pretty much the same thing. I'll cover it in brief. Someone posted online underneath the name Glittered Room for a View. And this story happened to a 4-year-old boy. Let's go ahead and call him Jones. Jones said, when I was 4 years old, I was in bed and I woke up. And I don't remember if I was napping or if it was late at night, but I do know I was supposed to be asleep. I woke up and there was a baby in the middle of my bedroom. So, of course, I jump out of bed and I start interacting with this baby. Oh, coochie coo, look at you cute little baby. Oh, look at this cute little baby. Eventually, my mom came in the room and go, Jones, what are you doing? Supposed to be asleep. Mom, look at this baby. This little baby came in the room. Oh, look at this cute little baby. Look at chubby little cheeks. And Jones's mom got really mad. And she's like, Jones, there's not a baby there. You need to be in bed. Get in bed. And Jones crawled into bed, and at that point, the baby started flying around the room, flying around his mom, and Jones is like, the baby's flying, Mommy, the baby's flying right over you. Oh, he's glowing. He's a gold glowing baby. And the mom's like, go to bed. There's no baby. It's not glowing. Just go to bed. And he can tell at this point his mom is even angrier. And he just lays there and she leaves the room. Jones said later, he goes, I don't remember if it was that same night or day or if it was a couple days later, but he goes, later on I overheard my parents, my dad, my mom were talking, and my dad goes, honey, you know kids make stuff up. You know kids see weird stuff. And he hears his mom say, but why now? Why is he making stuff up now? I'm really, really scared. He's never done anything like that before. 16 years later, Jones is talking to his mom, and I don't know if they're talking about the golden baby story specifically or just talking about life and things that happen. But Jones says, 16 years later, my mother had told me that she had an abortion when I was a kid. And he goes, I had vague memories of her being sick during that same time period when I saw that ghost baby, but I never put 2 and 2 together. I was only 4. I don't know anything like that. But 16 years later, when she said that she had an abortion, but Jones now looking back thinks that baby could have been his sibling who was aborted. There's a lot of stories like this. I come across, it's not super rare even in the paranormal community, right? Like earlier I said, having dreams about a loved one after they've passed within a short time period, dreaming of them saying goodbye. It's a fairly common paranormal event. Ghosts of children who are aborted is very rare. But we do come across them from time to time. It's obviously a very controversial topic. But it is an interesting subset of ghost stories. It's controversial, obviously, because it opens a whole can of worms as to when the human soul enters the body. I'm not even going to... I don't even feel comfortable getting into that. Getting into when that happens. And this isn't it. People who appreciate ghost stories, who believe in ghosts, depending on your view of this issue, depending on your view of abortion, these are ghost stories that people will say, I don't believe that one. Which is fair, right? You don't have to believe every ghost story at all. Probably be better off if you didn't. But it's interesting because, again, if you have a different view of when life begins, and someone has a vision or an experience of a ghost from when before life begins, then you go, well, that's not real. Because there was no life at that point. But again, we don't know how far along any of these participants were in this story. But I do come across these. They're rare, but the number's not 0. I normally don't cover them. I'm sure I covered this first one we did because I had seen that one recently. And what's interesting about that first one is it's not just the story of his aborted child. The child is older than it would have been when the pregnancy was terminated. So that's a whole, that opens up a whole other can of beans with this phenomenon. Old man dies, old man ghost. Young woman dies, young woman ghost. 3-month-old in the womb dies, 6-year-old boy ghost. Which we do see stuff like that. There was another story I was going to cover recently, I'll just say right now. There's a doctor who worked at a hospital. He said there was a woman who had died in the hospital, this old woman, very frail. And she passed away. She's probably in her 80s, 90s at this point. And her body was on a trolley. So probably a British doctor. Her body was on a trolley. And then I saw her ghost. She was a 30-year-old woman. She goes, I saw someone who looked exactly like her but younger walking away from her body. And not like her daughter, right? You go, don't daughters look like mothers? He goes, I kind of followed her. And she walked into this room, and he goes, I was walking towards the room, and in my head, I knew she wasn't going to be in there. She wasn't going to be in there, and he turns and he walks into the room, and she's not in there. So we do see age differences in ghosts sometimes as well. Again, not super common, but we do see it. So fascinating all around. I know it's a controversial topic, and I know this is one of those things where even if you're an avid ghost believer, you may go, I don't believe in those ghost stories, which again is totally fine. I think it's very fair to say that you believe in aliens, but you go, I don't believe in reptilians taking over the planet. So whenever I come across an alien story that involves reptilians taking over the planet, I kind of dismiss it. You can totally say stuff like that. I think reptilians are cool. I think they're the second coolest aliens next to the insectoids. But you can pick and choose. That is something that's fun about the world of the paranormal. You don't have to believe every single thing that comes out of it. But I wanted to share that with you. Again, I come across these stories every once in a while. I don't normally cover them because they're so controversial. But I thought, yeah, let's just stick all the controversy in one episode and take a look at them. Because even though some of these stories are controversial, they're still fascinating to think about. The world of the paranormal is just limitless. It really is limitless in its depth and its breadth. Is that a word? Is that a word? Its length of stories to discover. And that's the way you can do a daily paranormal podcast going on 6 years. In June, it'll be 6 years. So well, that ends our controversial cavalcade. It still sounds bad calling it that. It sounds like it should have been more fun, but crazy, crazy stories. Controversial stories. But hopefully they put a smile on your face. You're like, nope. Actually, I'm more depressed than I was before I started this podcast. DeadRabbitRadio@gmail.com is going to be our email address. You can also hit us up at Facebook.com/DeadRabbitRadio. TikTok is at DeadRabbitRadio. Dead Rabbit Radio is the daily paranormal conspiracy and true crime podcast. You don't have to listen to it every day, but I'm glad you listened to it today. Have a great one.